Those patterns are all quilted out, and these patterns have a definite end point. You can tell that by this straight line and this little curve right here. If you have a pattern that is pretty busy, what you may want to do is leave thread tails out so that you can be able to then roll your quilt and know where the ending point is. Before I chunk down the sides of the quilt and before I roll the quilt, I want to take care of this area that's right here in the middle. It is still within my sewable area, so I don't want to roll this quilt and chunk the two sides and then have to roll the quilt back to be able to do this center. What I will do is start a new quilt group, and in that quilt group, I'm going to name it Block and hit enter. And now I have a new quilt group, and I'm going to change this to a 1-inch grid because that's pretty dense with that 1/4 inch. Now I'm going to draw my boundaries to be able to place our first patterns. Remember, we loaded this quilt vertically. If I look back at our design group, then that tells me that my first block is the white block, which is going to be this pattern at the very top. If I change to another quilt group, you can see it right here. This is going to be the first one that I'm going to quilt. So what I'm going to do first in this one is place this back pattern, so to speak. You notice that whenever I click, it selects the crosshatch, but I want to quilt this pattern first. I want it to be the one that the crosshatch goes over. This is going to be my blue work, so this is the one I'm going to put in, and then I'm going to check my boundaries and put my crosshatch pattern in. The pattern that is in the back is going to be blue, but this pattern that is on top, that the crosshatch pattern, is the pattern that I'm going to do with micro quilter thread. I've got the stitch in the ditch done for this very first block that we're going to do. And because I did the stitch in the ditch, I can now select it and I can convert it pattern to boundary. That makes it a whole lot easier to have my boundary. If you choose not to do the stitch in the ditch, then that's fine. Just click out a boundary for this first block. I have my pattern selected, and I'm going to select my boundary, and I'm going to left click on pattern to boundary. And Creative Studio is going to fill up that boundary, but in this case, we don't want the pattern to fill the entire boundary because we're going to have that crosshatch that is going to also be in there, and to us the density is not quite the same. So if I go back to my vertical layout and if I show you that, I can see that this pattern is sized at 9.85. That's what we have in the layout, and we like that look. If I still have the pattern selected in the project tab and I hit the letter P on my keyboard, you can see that the pattern is designed at 765. So I'm going to go back to my blocks. I'm going to select this pattern, and I'm going to change right down here in selected pattern properties, 9.85. Freeze aspect is on because the little lock is locked, and I'm going to hit enter, and it's going to change the size of that pattern to 985. What I like about this is when you do pattern to boundary, the pattern comes in centered on that boundary. So by selecting it and changing it to 985, I am able to keep that pattern centered inside that boundary. So all I have to do now is stitch this one out and then put the crosshatch on top of it. So let me do that for you. I have quilted out the flower and it is done, and I am changing threads. We have 3 different color threads that we are using in this particular bed runner, and I change the threads as I go down the quilt. I don't want to quilt a section and then turn around and go back and change threads and quilt another section. It only takes just a minute to do that, so I don't run the risk of getting a pleat in it if I do go ahead and change out the threads as I go. This pattern has a little channel around it, so it has a jump stitch in it, which means that there is not a connecting thread around this outside part of the pattern and the inside part of the pattern. I want to check my boundary because I need it to be very accurate. Unlike the flower pattern, I want this crosshatch to absolutely go to the very edge, but I do not want it to go over into my border in any way. So just as a little test on shrinkage, I'm going to left click on Draw Boundary, and with the head of my machine, I'm going to click out that boundary again. Now you can see that the newest boundary is the one that is highlighted. This previous boundary is the one where I did the stitch in the ditch, and I did lean on it just a little bit right here on this side. So if I hit my letter K on my keyboard, it's going to select the old boundary, and I'm going to hit the word delete, and it gets rid of that boundary. I'm going to select this boundary. My pattern is selected. I'm going to go to Pattern to Boundary and make sure that it's on Standard and not Stretch. And I'm going to left click on Pattern to Boundary, and that's going to place that pattern for me. I want it to be a little bit closer to my edges. So I'm going to select the pattern. I'm going to my F10 handles because those are my center handles, and I'm going to pull that until it just barely touches that boundary, just maybe a stitch before that boundary. I'm going to turn my stitching points on, because if I have stitching points on, when it gets close to that boundary, and remember this is white fabric and the boundary and the border are blue fabrics, I want to be sure that I slow down a little bit when it gets to that point so I can make sure that it hits just before that blue fabric and not on top of that blue fabric. I can also select my pattern, and I can go to my little eye, and I can slow my speed down and hit Save and Close. And that way I have a little bit more control over it. You don't really want to lean on these lines, because if you lean on them, they're going to end up jagged. If you look at this pattern and you decide that these little lines right here need to come right into that corner, just select the pattern, do F7, which is your shortcut on your keyboard, hover over that pink node and you hold down your left mouse button and just drag that right into that corner, just like this. It's not going to really make a difference on your crosshatch, but it is going to make it look so much better whenever it hits that corner. So that's just a little tip for you. That one's quilted out, so let's go back to our vertical layout and review what we've done. We have quilted out the top border, and we have quilted out this block right here, the very first one. So now it's time to roll the quilt. It is our custom whenever you roll this quilt to do the basting on the sides, and if you are chunking, do your side patterns first, because if you do the side patterns first, then that keeps everything nice and straight on these very long borders. If you were to do the patterns and the blocks first, then that might have a tendency to make these borders wave just a little bit. So this way we're able to do these side patterns and quilt them out. So that's what we're going to do on this next little area. We have to go back to our border corner group, and that's the one that I named top border. You will see that I do not have this pattern right here, because I want to show you what happens when you turn the quilt and do that second method. We will have these patterns right here, so I can use end of set whenever I roll the quilt, or I can use relocate. So let me roll the quilt and baste down the sides, and then be able to come back and show you how we would proceed in chunking the sides of the quilt. And I have rolled my quilt, and you can see that this is where my needle position is, way up here at the top. What I'm going to do is left click on Roll Quilt, and Creative Studio is going to say, have you rolled your quilt and positioned your needle at the last sewn pattern's endpoint? And I'm going to say yes, left click. And Creative Studio is going to move those patterns up to where they need to be and now be in the correct position. If I am off a little bit, and it appears that I am, it means that I have not put my needle in the correct position. The other thing that I want you to notice is that boundaries do not move. These boundaries stayed right where they were. I can move my needle and put it at the correct pattern endpoint, and I can do roll quilt again. Instead of doing that, I want to show you relocate. This is another way to roll these patterns up. What I like about relocate is my needle is exactly on this little end point right here. So you can see that I've got a little bit of shrinkage going on. Because I placed that needle on my quilt and I have thread tails hanging out, I know where that position is. So I'm going to select a pattern. It doesn't have to be this pattern, because see what happened? Your handles get in the way. I'm going to select a different pattern. I'm going to right click and I'm going to go down to relocate, and I'm going to say shift all to one point, and I'm going to left click. What I like about this is where one goes, everybody goes. And it's going to take care of any shrinkage, because it's going to put these patterns back exactly in the spot where that needle is on that machine. I can scroll in really close. I can even do end snap if I want to. You see how that little pink dot jumped? I can left click, and I know that my needle is exactly on that point, so I'm going to say yes with a left click. You see how that pattern jumped to that exact position? Boundaries still do not move, but now I have my patterns back in line. I'm going to delete this boundary. What you would normally have is this pattern right here on both sides, but because we're going to turn the quilt for this right side, we're only going to chunk down one side of the quilt, not both sides of the quilt. These steps in chunking that you do, you would duplicate on both sides of the quilt. I have my pattern copied. I'm going to draw a boundary of what my sewable area is on this left side, and I typically start on the left side, and that's going to tell me how much space I've got. So I'm going to left click on draw boundary. I'm going to hit my S on my keyboard to turn my snaps off. I'm going to move my crosshair out of the way, and I'm going to hit escape so that that boundary is not highlighted. Now I'm going to say paste, but I can see that whenever I paste this pattern that I'm going to be able to fit two patterns in this sewable space. So instead of connecting these patterns every single time that I go down this quilt, let me show you what I would do. I'm going to delete these patterns, and I am going to paste a copy of the pattern right here on the computer screen, and I'm going to paste a second pattern on the computer screen up above it, and I'm going to right click to let go of paste. Because I placed the first one and then the second one above it, you can see my start and end are already in the correct position. They are not connected, and I do not want to connect them with F11 handles, because if I do, I am going to skew the angle on this pattern. I'm going to hold down my Alt key, and I'm going to click on the right arrow, and I'm going to scroll in really close. You see how that's getting closer and closer and closer? Now I can go to nodes because I want to join them. I can turn my E on my keyboard, hover over that node, and snap that node. I get a pink dot. So as long as I have a pink dot, then I know that those two patterns are connected. I also do not have a teal marker in the middle of those patterns, so that means that these patterns will sew continuously. Now that I have done that, I'm going to select them, and I'm going to copy Once again, now I'm able to place 2 patterns at one time, which is what will fit in my sewable space. I'm going to select these patterns and I'm going to move them right over here because I know that pattern is in the correct position because remember I did a relocate. So I'm going to place those patterns right there. I'm going to look at my boundary lines. This one is sitting a little bit off, so I'm going to select these patterns and I am going to do my Alt and move them ever so slightly, just the least little bit, and now I know that these patterns are ready to go and they are able to stitch. I don't want to start down at this bottom on this pattern. I want to start up at the top, and the reason that I want to start at the top is because if I start at the bottom and sew up, if I have shrinkage, then it might not match up with this pattern that is already sewn. If I select this pattern and I left click on order join, it goes to the patterns on the top, and that's not what I want it to do. I need to make a break here, and now I'm going to select this pattern, left click on order join, and it goes to the bottom. What I have done is reverse the start and end of these 2 patterns, but there has to be a break between this pattern and this pattern, or Creative Studio is going to go around the top. I don't want it to do that. Now when I tell it to start quilting, it will take a stitch, and that stitch should be exactly at the ending point of this pattern right here. I would do the same thing on this side, the right side. Draw a boundary, place my 2 patterns in the boundary, but on this side I would start sewing top to bottom. So let me show you that in just a second. Let's quilt these out and then I'll show you what that looks like. Those patterns are sewn out, and remember I have a copy of the 2 of them. This pattern would already be sewn on this side. I've drawn out my boundary on my right side. Remember I had these patterns copied, so now I'm going to hit paste. They are oriented the same way that the left side is, so all I have to do is hit my space bar twice, put that pattern in position. I would have my needle right here at the end of this pattern. Notice that the start point is already correct on that one, and I would sew those patterns out. Once that is done, I'm going to go back to the vertical layout and show you that then I would stitch these 2 patterns, and I'm going to show you how to do that. Once those patterns are done, you would roll your quilt, do another relocate, and now you can just paste these patterns the way that you need them as you go all the way down the quilt. Remember, these boundaries are not going to relocate. Only the patterns are going to relocate. So that's basically how you would do chunking down a quilt. Now that those are quilted out, I'm ready to go back to my block group, place my needle in this point right here on this little flower. One of the things I like so much about relocate is I'm able to see exactly how much shrinkage I have going on, or how much I have moved that quilt, because remember I am tugging on that quilt and I am doing the border, so this may not just be pattern shrinkage, this may be my tugging on the quilt. So I'm going to select the pattern, and again it does not matter which pattern I select. I'm going to right click and I'm going to relocate, and I'm going to say shift all to one point. I'm going to click on this point right here, which is where my needle is. I'm going to say yes, and Creative Studio moves those patterns up to exactly where they need to be. Boundaries do not move, so I can delete this boundary. With custom, these patterns right here being relocated is more of a visual, because if I had started clicking out the boundary for the next block, it would have come in very likely on top of these. That's more just a visual. Borders, yes, that's important. You want to know exactly where those patterns are. You want to get them realigned on the quilt with the computer screen. Blocks and custom, it doesn't make that much difference. I'm going to go to Draw Boundary, and I'm going to click out a boundary for our next block. I have clicked out that boundary. When I'm clicking out boundaries and I'm doing pattern to boundary, I'm clicking the high side of the seam. When I am clicking out stitch in the ditch, I am clicking the low side of the seam. I'm going to select this pattern. We do want the pattern to fill up the boundary, so I'm going to left click on pattern to boundary. I'm going to look at that pattern, and I can change my grid to 1/4 inch. That looks pretty good to me. So I am ready to stitch this one out. I'm going to click continue with a left click because I have finished quilting that block. What we have here is a pattern that doesn't have a definite center. We've also got a quilt that does not have a definite center. We want to place this little Derby Daisy pattern right there in the center of that framework, just like it is on this one right here. Sometimes that's hard to find the center whenever you don't have any piecing. So we're going to show you a real easy way to do that. I'm going to go back to Draw Boundary, and with the head of my machine, I'm going to click in the upper left. I'm going to go down to the lower right. I'm going to go to the upper right, down to the lower left, and I'm going to hit close drawing, and I'm going to hit exit drawing. And now I can put my crosshair exactly in the center of that X that I have drawn. Now, if you can't get right there in the center, that's okay, because I'm going to show you what else we can do. I have my pattern selected. I'm going to go to Repeat Patterns and left click, and I'm going to change my point type to center, just like this. And I can scroll in, and I can left click on that X point that it makes on that block. Once that I do that, I'm going to say OK, select my pattern, and use my F10 handles and bring that pattern down until I like the size of it. I can either use my F10 handles, or I can go right here and change the size, whichever way I think fits best. That way I have that pattern centered exactly in that block. And now once I decide that I like that setup, I can quilt that one out and it'll be ready. So just a real quick, easy way for you to find the center of a block using Creative Studio. Let me quilt that one out. Let's go back and review just a minute, please. What we did was quilt out the top border, and we also had this one pattern on this side. We're talking about chunking down the quilt now. So this is what we would do first, is this top border with these two side repeats. Then we would quilt the flower. Next, we're going to quilt the cross hatching, and they're in a different quilt group. Then we are going to roll our quilt, and we are able to place two of the side repeats. So we would quilt those. Then if we are chunking down the sides, we would quilt the right side. Now we're going to quilt this frame and quilt the center flower in the frame. Once we have that done, we're going to roll the quilt again, and we would repeat the process of quilting this side, chunking down the sides, quilting this side, chunking down the sides, then the center flower, then the cross hatching one more time. And we would continue doing that all the way down the quilt until we got close to the bottom. I'm going to toggle all of this as sewn. And when we can get this bottom part up on our table, we would set up border corner for the bottom. And I'm going to show you how to do that when we get down there. And we would quilt this part. Then we would put in, and I would hope that I have 2 of these. I didn't want to delete that. Thank you. I would leave these 2, quilt in the bottom, and then go back and place these 2 patterns, because if there's any shrinkage, I'd be able to distribute that shrinkage on a farther distance. So that's what I would do. Quilt those on both sides, and then quilt the last part of the center flower and then the cross hatching. So that's what you would do when you are chunking down the sides of the quilt. I'm going to show you when I get down there what it looks like to set up the bottom of a quilt and be able to do that in border corner. So let me work a little bit farther down the quilt, because I'm just repeating the process of these blocks on the inside and chunking this left side. I have left this right side open because remember, we're also going to show you about turning the quilt. So that side is open. So let me continue to chunk down the sides of this quilt and show you what happens whenever I get down to the bottom of it.